The rain poured down like an unrelenting waterfall, drumming against the pavement as the wind howled through the empty streets. It was one of those nights where the cold seemed to seep into your bones, making even the strongest shiver. The city, lights flickered in the distance, their glow barely piercing the heavy downpour. On the steps of a towering glass-covered mansion, a woman stood huddled with her 2 children, their small bodies pressed tightly against her for warmth. She clutched them close, shielding them as best as she could from the bitter wind. Clothes were soaked through, her hands trembling, but she kept whispering reassurances to her little ones. "Just a little while, my loves," she murmured, brushing wet strands of hair from her daughter's pale face. "The rain will stop soon." The little boy, no older than 6, buried his face into his mother's coat. "Mama, I'm cold," he whimpered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The woman swallowed the lump in her throat. She had no home to return to, no shelter to offer them. Her last few coins had gone into buying them a small meal that barely filled their stomachs. All she could do now was wait and hope for a miracle, just someone to show a little kindness, a little humanity. Behind them, the grand mansion stood in stark contrast to their suffering. It was the kind of house most could only dream of. Tall, pristine, with golden lights spilling from its windows. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, their polished exteriors glistening under the rain. This was the home of Victor Langston, a man known for his wealth, power, and ruthless business tactics. A self-made millionaire, he had built an empire from nothing. But along the way, his heart had turned to stone. Money had become his only companion. And in his world, there was no room for pity. Inside, Victor sat in his lavish living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the rain beat against the enormous floor-to-ceiling windows. He barely noticed the storm outside, lost in thoughts of his next big business deal. To him, the world was a game where only the strongest survived. He had played his cards right, and now he was at the top. A sudden chime from his security system snapped him from his thoughts. With a frown, he grabbed the remote and switched the screen to the front door camera. His expression darkened. There they were, a woman and 2 kids, soaked to the bone, sitting on his doorstep like stray animals. His jaw tightened. What was it about the rain that always brought out the desperate ones? He had seen people like this before, always looking for a handout, always expecting something. He wasn't running a charity. Without hesitation, he pressed the intercom button. His voice came through cold and sharp. "Get off my property!" The woman flinched at the sudden voice. She turned her tired eyes to the camera, her expression a mixture of hope and desperation. "Sir, please, we're just trying to stay dry. We'll leave as soon as the rain stops." Victor sighed, rubbing his temples. "Not my problem. Go find a shelter." The woman hesitated, glancing at her shivering children. She took a deep breath and spoke again, her voice trembling. "I understand, sir, but there's nowhere else to go. My children—" Victor cut her off. "Not my concern. Leave now before I call security." Tears welled in the woman's eyes, but she nodded. She knew pleading wouldn't change a man like this. With a heavy heart, she helped her children to their feet, their tiny hands gripping onto hers as they stepped away from the warmth of the doorway. And back into the freezing night, the wind lashed at them, the rain soaking them even further. But there was no other choice. Victor watched as they disappeared into the storm, their figures growing smaller until they were swallowed by the darkness. He turned off the camera, drained the rest of his whiskey, and leaned back with a satisfied sigh. People needed to learn to help themselves. But what Victor Langston didn't know was that this moment, this one choice, would soon come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. The storm raged on as the woman and her children disappeared into the night, their fragile figures swallowed by the cold and unforgiving city. Victor Langston didn't spare them another thought. To him, it was just another evening, another moment where he had successfully kept his boundaries intact. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress around himself, one made of wealth, power, and an unshakable belief that kindness was a weakness. He had no time for sob stories. The world was harsh, and only the strongest survived. But fate has a way of testing even the most immovable hearts. The next morning, Victor awoke to the usual routine, his phone buzzing with emails, his assistant reminding him of meetings, and his schedule packed with deals that would bring him even more wealth. He hardly noticed the news headlines flashing across his phone screen until a particular article caught his eye. Widow and 2 children found unconscious near City Park after night in freezing rain. Something in his chest tightened, though he quickly dismissed it as a mere coincidence. There were plenty of homeless people in the city, and he had nothing to do with their choices. But as his eyes skimmed the article, his stomach sank. The description was too familiar. A woman and 2 children. Last seen seeking shelter near an upscale neighborhood. His neighborhood. Victor shook his head, pushing away the thought. He had done nothing wrong. He wasn't responsible for them, but the feeling didn't leave him. Over the next few days, Victor found himself unable to shake the image of the woman's pleading eyes, the way the children had clung to her. He tried to drown himself in work, in luxury, in everything that usually distracted him, but the unease followed him, lingering like a shadow. Then, fate intervened again. One afternoon, while heading into a high-end restaurant for a business meeting, Victor was approached by a journalist, holding a microphone and a cameraman trailing behind. "Mr. Langston, would you like to comment on the woman and children who were found unconscious near your estate?" Victor's expression hardened. "I don't see how that's any of my concern. Sources say they were last seen seeking shelter outside your home," the journalist pressed. "Some say you turned them away." Victor's jaw clenched. The last thing he needed was bad press. "I owe no explanations. I did nothing wrong." The journalist raised an eyebrow. "Would you say the same if something had happened to them?" Victor didn't answer. He pushed past the cameras, irritation flaring in his chest. Why was this his problem? People suffered every day. It wasn't his responsibility to save them, but the whispers followed him. Employees at his company exchanged glances when he walked by. Social media lit up with speculation. Some called him heartless. Others defended him, saying a man of his status couldn't be expected to help every stranger who knocked on his door. But the discussion didn't die down. If anything, it grew. And then, something happened that Victor never expected. One evening, he arrived home late after another long day of trying to ignore the growing controversy. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed a woman standing near his gate. She was not the widow he had turned away, but there was something familiar about her. Her eyes held the same quiet pain, the same exhaustion. "Mr. Langston," she said softly. "My name is Elena." He stared at her warily. "Do I know you?" She hesitated. "I'm Sarah's sister, the woman you turned away that night." Victor felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. "Is she? She's alive," Elena said quickly. "She and the kids are recovering, but it was close, too close." Victor exhaled, unsure if it was relief or guilt pressing against his chest. "Why are you here?" Elena studied him for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to see the man who closed his door on my family. I wanted to understand how someone could do that." His defenses immediately went up. "I don't owe you an explanation. I'm not here to fight with you," she said. "I just want you to know who Sarah is. She wasn't always struggling. Her husband died in an accident. Last year, they lost everything. She tried to hold on, tried to build a new life, but the world isn't kind to people like her. Elena's voice wavered, but she held her gaze steady. She's not a beggar, Mr. Langston. She's a mother who had nowhere left to turn. Victor looked away. He didn't like this feeling, this slow, creeping discomfort inside him. It was easier to believe that people like Sarah had made bad choices, that their suffering was their own fault. Elena sighed. I don't expect you to change overnight, but I hope that the next time someone knocks on your door, you remember that not everyone is trying to take advantage of you. Sometimes, people just need a little mercy. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Victor standing in the cold night, his mind restless, his heart heavier than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he didn't recognize, a crack in the walls he had built around himself. And though he wasn't ready to admit it yet, something inside him was shifting. But whether that shift would lead to redemption or regret remained to be seen. Victor Langston sat alone in his grand mansion, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on the table in front of him. The silence of the house, which he had once found comforting, now felt suffocating. Elena's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes, people just need a little mercy. He had spent his whole life believing that success was a battle, that everyone had to fight for themselves. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. The next morning, he made a decision. One that felt strange, even unnatural, but unavoidable. He needed to see Sarah, not to fix things, not to silence the growing guilt in his chest, but because he couldn't ignore the weight of his actions anymore. Victor's car pulled up to a small, aging apartment complex on the rougher side of town. It was a place he never would have stepped foot in before, but today he walked inside without hesitation. He knocked on the door of apartment 12B. A few seconds passed before it creaked open. And there she was. Sarah looked thinner than he remembered, but her eyes held the same quiet strength. A little girl peeked from behind her leg, gripping her mother's dress. Victor recognized her immediately, the same child who had shivered on his doorstep that night. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then finally, Victor cleared his throat. I heard you were recovering, he said. I wanted to check on you. Sarah studied him carefully. Why? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because I should have done it sooner. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Sarah's expression remained unreadable, but she stepped aside, opening the door wider. Would you like to come in? Victor nodded and stepped inside. The apartment was small, with only a few pieces of worn furniture, but it was neat. More than that, it was warm. The smell of something cooking filled the air, and laughter drifted from the next room where Sarah's son was playing. It was nothing like his mansion, yet it felt fuller, more alive. They sat at the kitchen table. Sarah poured him a cup of tea, the steam curling between them. I don't know what you're expecting me to say, she admitted. I'm grateful my kids and I are safe, but I won't lie to you, Mr. Langston. That night, it broke something in me. Victor flinched. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, but he didn't look away. I don't expect forgiveness, he said honestly. I don't know. I thought money could solve everything, but I don't think that's what you need. Sarah nodded. Money helps, but kindness, that can save someone. Victor sat with that thought, feeling it settle in his chest. Then, in a voice softer than he expected, he said, I'd like to help. The right way this time. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Help how? I don't want to just write a check and walk away, he said. I want to do something real, something that lasts. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but she didn't let him off easy. If you're serious about helping, then don't just help me. Help people like me, the ones no one sees. Victor swallowed hard. He had spent years closing himself off from the world, believing that wealth and power were the only things that mattered. But now, he saw things differently. He wasn't sure how or what it would take, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to do something that wasn't just about him. A week later, news broke that Victor Langston, one of the most powerful businessmen in the city, was funding a new initiative for struggling families, housing programs, job training, education. It wasn't about charity. It was about giving people a fair chance. Sarah never asked him for anything again. She didn't need to. But she did something that surprised even Victor. She invited him to dinner one night, not as a businessman, not as a millionaire, just as a man trying to change. As he sat at the small dinner table with Sarah and her children, listening to their laughter, something shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he felt something more valuable than power or wealth. He felt human again.